Welcome to the Home Building Hub, your essential podcast guide to building your new home. Hosted by industry experts Colin Bischoff and Darren Brennan, this conversational podcast will help better educate you about all things new home building so you can avoid costly mistakes and enjoy your building experience to the fullest, no matter which home builder you choose.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to the Home Building Hub. You are with Colin and co-host Darren Brennan, as always. And oh boy, Darren, guess what? We're going to talk about HIA today, the Housing Industry Australia, for people who don't know what that is. This is a really good episode for home buyers. It's a really good episode for even those industry folk as well, because we'll be covering what the HIA is, what it does, I guess some of the areas that they cover, and more importantly, some of the areas and misconceptions around what they don't cover. We'll touch on how to best review contracts. We'll talk about highlighting some of the common errors that we come across. We'll talk about recent upcoming building regulations and potentially touch on the future of building in Victoria. Now, I say we, Darren, but I'm probably lying because, truth be told, you and I aren't qualified to talk about any of that stuff, are we? So
no, but we'll we've got the perfect guest to do so with us.
We do. So we thought, let's bring in the big guns. Let's talk to the main man. And that is the Executive Director of the HIA Victoria, Keith Ryan. He's here to join us and take us through all those topics.
Thank you very much, Colin and Darren. Great to be with you this morning.
Yeah, welcome to the Home Building Hub, and it's great to get you on board. We've had you on our hit list for a while to try and get you on board, obviously, and we've had a few discussions over the last 6 months, Keith, to find a time that we can actually pin you down to get you on, and we're wrapped over you on board this morning. So thanks so much. And
no, well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we're maybe to kick things off, Keith, how about you give us a bit about your history and what led you to the HIA?
Sure. Well, look, my terrible past is that I was a lawyer. I worked in commercial litigation. Then I worked in construction law back in the last century. So I'm giving away my vintage now. Mm-hmm. And then I got involved I was doing a Master of Business Administration part-time and thought I'd get an easier job. So I found myself working in government in the transport space for many years. And after doing that, did my consultancy for a while, started getting back into construction law, and then found myself at the HIA managing their team that provide legal information and guidance to their members, and over time evolved into the executive director. So it's been a 10-year journey at HIA for me almost.
Yeah, great. And then obviously a lot's happened over that period of time. There's been a hectic 10 years in the industry, really.
It has been. The first 7 years were pretty busy, and then it went on turbocharge with obviously the COVID pandemic and then everything that happened after that. And it's been still pretty rough at the moment, but I think the good news is that whilst, yes, we've had some unfortunate situations occurring, we've had some insolvencies, we've had some builders getting into trouble, there's also been a lot of builders doing a great job holding on, keeping their clients happy, finishing their homes, and continuing to run their businesses successfully despite all those challenges. And I think we're very, very much now at a point where things are going to get better. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to start happening. And I think we should look forward to, hopefully, by the end of this year, much better conditions.
Yeah, we agree. We last, I guess, a couple of episodes ago, we talked a little bit about that in 2025. And for us in our industry there, Keith, 2024 was a good stabiliser in a lot of respects.
Totally agree with you, yes.
And that was great for all of us to see, because it was not fun before that. But perhaps let's dive into the first main question. I guess let's talk about, if it's okay, Keith, could you please cover what is the HIA? What's the role of the HIA? How does it support builders and home buyers?
Thank you. Look, yes, the HIA, Housing Industry Association, is an industry association which represents businesses working in the home building industry. So whilst a lot of our members are home builders, we also have other people involved in helping supply homes to your buyers. So we have consultants, we have contractors, we have manufacturers, we have suppliers. They all are part of the chain which supplies homes, and many of them are members of HIA. A lot of our members work in detached homes, but also many work in smaller multi-unit and even some larger multi-unit projects. So we have a fairly diverse membership, but fundamentally HIA is about supporting businesses to build homes for people to live in. And everything we do is helping our members to achieve that goal and to work with governments and other key agencies to ensure that what they do doesn't frustrate getting homes built, and more importantly, getting homes built in a way that's affordable and meets the needs of buyers. Because ultimately, what we and our members want to see is people able to move into their new home happy and satisfied with what they've got. And that's a pretty important thing for us.
It's the same for all of us, isn't it? Without customers, the end consumer, none of us are here. So, it's pretty important, I guess, that we're satisfying their needs along the way, and we've got a common goal in that respect.
That's right. And look, it's probably also worth stressing that a lot of the work that I do with advocacy with governments in particular is keeping in mind that we want people to be able to live in a home, to be safe and secure, and to have some financial stability and certainty as well about their life. And so the current housing situation we're facing, where there's a shortage of homes, is very much a problem of supply. And what is frustrating is that there's plenty of builders out there who would love to be able to provide more homes. And there's a lot of red tape and other bureaucracy that is frustrating that. It's true that there's also industry conditions which are making it hard. But there is a great capacity for our members and our industry as a whole to provide more homes and get people into that state of financial certainty and safety and having their own home. And I think that's really a critical part which drives why we do what we do.
There's also constraints on people's borrowing capacity too that don't allow that, and that's obviously tightened up over the last, couple of years as well. So for the relief
Yes,
there's
and look, we have HIA does have an economics team led by Tim Reardon, and they're very passionate about that particular point at the moment. They've got a very powerful view that the prudential regulators, the regulators who regulate the financial institutions like banks, are being overly cautious at the moment. And I find that's a bit of a trend with government in general. There tends to be a bit of a paternalistic, patronising approach towards people. They tend not to give people credit for what they're capable of doing and tend to assume that they can't make their own rational decisions. And I think, unfortunately, prudential regulation is one example of that. Obviously, we're not saying let everyone just go and get whatever they want, and banks aren't dumb enough to do that anyway, but there are some restrictions at the moment which do need to be looked at. And hopefully, particularly as we're facing sometime this year, hopefully sooner rather than later, a cut in interest rates and ideally consumer confidence starting to really improve. I think that's important that we don't have unnecessary barriers frustrating that consumer desire.
Absolutely. I think we're of the same opinion. Interest rates at some stage this year is going to come back, and that consumer confidence will pick up, which will be great. Maybe moving to our next question for you. What are some of the common areas, I guess, or misconceptions that people have about the HIA and what's covered and what's not covered by them as such? Maybe if you could touch on that, it'd be great.
Absolutely. And look, we're probably in part a victim of our own success in the sense that we sell probably more home building contracts for use by builders than anyone else. Our contracts are used by most of the large builders, and they're pretty well known. And in fact, often you'll see people talking about domestic building laws that just refer to HIA contract as being a generic thing,
For sure.
which means that to a lot of consumers, they see HIA as being obviously someone that's quite important. And obviously that's very pleasing, but we are fundamentally an industry association, and our job is to support our members. We're not the agency which can be helping consumers to solve their problems with builders. We're not the agency that can interpret or act like lawyers for consumers. We can point people in the right direction, and we do sometimes, in some extreme cases, give a little bit of a prod to help them out, particularly if we're dealing with cases where there's probably some, dare I say, good cause to do so. But fundamentally, we can't take a call from a consumer and say, look, okay, your contract, this is how it's meant to be interpreted, and this is whether your builder's done the right thing or not. And quite frankly, if you're a consumer, if you know that we represent builders, you should be a little bit skeptical anyway, because why would we be helping consumers to do over our members?
Yep.
We're not going to give consumers false advice, but we can't really step in either. And we also know that usually we're getting one side of the story. So we are able to provide a little bit of help we do have on our website some resources to help buyers understand our products and how our members work. We do also have a code of ethics, and that's very important. So if you believe that your builder or someone in the home building industry who's a member of ours has acted unethically, and I mean unethically, then we do have a process where we can ask our members to explain themselves. And we have in the past had members who have been removed from membership because they've been unethical. And that's something that particularly my regional executive committee, which is our more long-serving members, they're very passionate about. They don't want to see their membership being stained by people who are misbehaving.
Yeah.
But that is unethical behaviour. If we get complaints that, look, the builder didn't do what I wanted, I don't think the builder's following the contract properly, generally they tend to be civil disputes, and we don't have the authority to go and tell anyone what they should do. That's unfortunately when you're in the path of going down the legal dispute resolution process, which unfortunately is at the moment badly broken in Victoria, and it's probably not much better around the rest of the country, quite frankly. And I can understand that at times we do get consumers calling us as a last resort. And this is a really sad. At times we've had our reception so busy, I've actually grabbed phone calls. I've had reports in the past that sometimes up to half the calls we get in a day could be from consumers trying to get help. And I've even taken a few of these calls, and often I go, okay, well, look, what you need to do is speak to this government agency. And a few times the response I've got is, oh, I've already tried them. And that's pretty devastating. That's not great. And hopefully there are going to be some improvements there.
Yeah. And obviously in Victoria, the government's announced some changes there too, which will be good. So, hopefully they are changes for the good, I guess, is more the point. But at least it's recognised that it's not performing the way it should. So
that's right. Yes. Look, there's some work being done. It takes time, and it has been a little bit frustrating how long it's taken. But there are some signs that it could get better.
I guess for us, Keith, we're really focused on helping home buyers. We're obviously from the industry. We're pro builder, as are you, and your members are builders. And for those who are looking at building or just going through the process now, understand that HIA contract that you're looking at, it's not a one-way street. It's there to set the standard and set the tone, so that there's some consistency across what you're seeing.
Absolutely. And it's probably worth stressing the contracts are very regulated by legislation. So what can be in those contracts is pretty tight. We don't have the flexibility to put in lots of extra bells and whistles, which would make the contract perhaps deal with every single scenario. They have, to some extent, a bit of a generic nature, which means that they don't always meet the needs of builders or consumers, but they are reasonably fair and balanced. There are some areas where we think their law can be improved, and I'm sure consumer groups would love to have a few changes as well. But fundamentally, a lot of the content of our contract tries to equally balance the rights of consumers as well as protect our members. Yeah. Because we know that most of our members, most people in the industry, want their clients to be treated fairly and to get what they've bargained for. And the contract does a pretty good job of achieving that.
Yeah, which is good. I just sort of clarify that. And I guess leading on from that point, if people now understand, based on what we've discussed already, what the HIA is, what it does, and probably what it doesn't do, for those who are, I guess, looking to get some help at some stage, maybe some right now, but some who are starting the journey now, and in 3 months from now that they want to get some help, instead of calling, I guess, the HIA, what are some of the options for them to reach out for in terms of getting some advice and assistance?
Definitely. Look, I guess probably the first point or bit of advice I'd give to buyers is that my experience from being a private construction lawyer as well as being a lawyer working for HIA and then progressing up the chain is that most of the disputes between builders and clients have their start in the process of setting up the job in the first place. And what often happens is that the client or the builder have some misunderstanding about what's been agreed to. Sometimes there's expectations which people don't quite work out, can't be met. Sometimes you get consumers who believe that, I'm getting shall we say, a bronze price product, but I should get a platinum class quality. You don't get that balancing. You also tend to have a lot of consumers and builders who will decide, yes, let's do a deal, but they don't want to lock themselves in too much. And that's one of the biggest dangers. A lot of people want to have the flexibility to say, okay, well, I want to change the job as it goes. Now, the problem is that with any product, and particularly a home, the more you start changing it, the further down the chain you go, or the process you go, the harder it gets, the more expensive it gets. And that's why most builders, particularly volume builders who have to build on scale, will tend to try and make sure as much as possible they lock in and have clear certainty about what is going to be built and what it will cost. So that the client has that certainty and the builder has the certainty to make sure that they can get the product that they want. And I find that a lot of consumers get themselves into trouble by thinking, well, no, I want more than that. And unfortunately, they often can't. The other common trap I find is that a lot of consumers have a tendency to sit on their concerns. They tend not to immediately rush off and say to the builder, look, I'm not happy about this. Sometimes, look, I can understand builders are busy and they might go, look, this is a bit of a waste of my time. But as a general observation, my experience is that most builders prefer to know sooner rather than later that the client's worried about something. It's much easier to resolve an issue and get it fixed early on rather than waiting towards the end. And one of the reasons why our domestic building dispute system is currently really suffering is that there's a tendency of both builders and clients to wait until the end of the build process, the very pointy end, to start having all their disputes, many of which could have been resolved much earlier. And because they've all built up, it makes it what could have been a relatively simple dispute in isolation into a massive bonfire. And that is really quite sad. So I would urge buyers that if you're not comfortable, you're not happy, you're not sure, talk to your builder. Builders prefer to know what is going on sooner rather than later. And many of them, quite frankly, will chew your ear off anyway if you give them half a chance on the phone or having a chat, having a coffee, having a tea. So don't be shy about getting in touch. They may not get back to you immediately, but they'll get back to you because they understand the importance of dealing with feedback.
For sure. It's interesting you touch on those sort of changes, and it's something that I've always been passionate about over the years is that, people draw a house on a napkin and expect to be able to build it. And, if you
Yes.
think of in the scheme of life, you don't draw a car on a napkin and go down the road to the mechanic and go, can you build this for me? It's
That's right.
just quite amazing how everyone thinks they're an architect. And I think that does cause a whole lot of headache, certainly for the volume guys, where that's not their specialty, but they're trying to accommodate that customer. It's really interesting to watch. And, the more the volume builders can convince the customer out of making some of those changes, the better
Absolutely.
the journey
Look,
for
yeah,
that
I totally
customer
agree with you,
is
Darren.
throughout, and the less
I
things
think
that go wrong, and the less headaches that are caused, and the less time they're ringing you or the other government agencies for help because something's gone pear-shaped. So,
yes. Now, if things have gone pear-shaped, there are at the moment two main regulators who deal with builders and consumer complaints. And it's the first one is Consumer Affairs Victoria. In some states, it's called Fair Trading or something similar. And it's a body which is empowered to deal with disputes between consumers and businesses, including builders. And they particularly are meant to be focusing on the contracts and the payment terms and how builders and clients relate to each other. But there's also a regulator, the Victorian Building Authority, which deals with builders' licenses as well as builders complying with the building code, or the National Construction Code as it's now called. And what we find is that sometimes and this has been picked up by government and accepted by them, but sometimes consumers will go to one of those two bodies and say, I've got a concern about my builder. And human tendency being what it is, at times there's a approach of saying, oh, well, look, this sounds more like a technical issue than a contract issue. You need to go to the other regulator. And consumers find themselves in the crack. And that's often where we start getting calls as well. And that's really frustrating because ultimately the consumer just wants to get their dispute resolved. They want to have some certainty about what they need to do. And having those two regulators potentially buck passing, and I'm not saying it happens every time, but it does happen, and it is extremely frustrating for those people who get caught up in that scenario, and I can understand why they're so annoyed. That said, as a rule of thumb, I would suggest that if you have a concern about the contract terms, the nature of whether you're getting what you expect you're getting, Consumer Affairs Victoria is the place you're currently meant to go. And that is a place which has the experience, or should have the experience, of dealing with particularly payment terms, contracts and the like. If your concern is about the builder not building to the building code, or not building what's required by other building regulations, then probably the first port of call really should be the Victorian Building Authority, because that's their core business. Now, they can, to some extent, help with other stuff, but my advice to consumers and to buyers would be that if you're not sure, go to Consumer Affairs first, because most of the time a dispute between a builder and a client is about the contract, the payments, and usually that is better dealt with by Consumer Affairs. But if it's about the work not being safe, the work not being to standards required by the law, then yes, go to the VBA. Now, we're currently in February 2025. Sometime later this year, that could be a little bit different. But at the moment, yes, that's the advice I'd give to buyers.
Yeah, I think note that down if you're listening, Colin. On the podcast, that's some great advice there of sort of that direction of where to go if you've got those challenges. And I think that's a key, one of the key takeaways of today's podcast will be that last minute of info from you, Keith, which is fantastic. Sorry, Colin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so that clears up who to go to for what, which is fantastic, because there's so much confusion around that, truth be told. What about, what would you say, you've got a few points here that we did notice. What are some things that people could do to best protect themselves, to prevent, I guess, having to go in the first place?
Absolutely. And look, some of it's a bit what I've already said, which is make sure you know what you actually want to get built. Make sure that you understand what you're getting and your expectations are being met or are realistic. We do find that a lot of people just don't seem to want to do that, and they find themselves having half-baked ideas about what they'll get at the end, and then when it doesn't happen, not surprisingly, they start getting quite stressed about it. So there's a reason why the Victorian law, in fact, I'm pretty sure the law around the entire country, says that when a home building contract is signed, you're meant to have enough plans and specifications in place that you can go off and get a building permit straight away. In other words, you've locked in what's going to be built, and you're also meant to have the price locked in, or the pricing method, in the case of cost-plus contracts, locked in. And that's important because you need to know, what you're getting and what you're paying. And if you sign a contract without really having locked that in properly, you're always going to get into trouble. So you really need to take the time. And most builders, particularly bigger builders, have a process where they'll sit down with you and explain the contract, explain what you're getting, and double check to make sure that you are getting what you expected to get. And that process can take some time, and some businesses can really seem to be dragging it out a bit, but that's because they're trying to make sure that that big problem doesn't happen and you have that certainty and clearness. And I really stress that with buyers, take that time. Don't rush it. Make sure that you're sure about what you're doing, and don't be shy about asking questions. The other key thing I have to stress is that for most listeners of your podcast, they're probably looking at getting a new home built. So they probably aren't necessarily at as much risk of having a builder who's not properly licensed or registered, as we call in Victoria, or properly insured build their home. There are important safeguards in place. For example, when the building permit gets issued, the building surveyor should be checking to make sure that the right builder is on the insurance and that builder does have the right registration to do the building work. And it's very rare that goes wrong, but there are cases where it can get a little bit pear-shaped. But it's really important, though, that for your own peace of mind, that when you are going to sign a contract, you make sure that you are dealing with a reputable business. Many of the businesses you hear about, obviously the ones you hear about in the media, in the sense of the media ads and so on, they are registered builders. They have a long history. They are established. But if you're dealing with someone who is coming into the industry or you haven't heard of before, there's no harm in checking to make sure that they are a registered builder, very important, and no harm in just making sure that you check that they are able to buy the domestic building insurance and they give you that policy. Now, that's been a bit of a contentious point lately, but it's pretty straightforward the way the system is meant to work. If you sign a home building contract, before you're required to pay a deposit for the actual building contract itself, you're supposed to get a copy of the Certificate of Domestic Building Insurance. And you should make sure you check that and make sure that the name of the builder on that certificate matches the name of the builder that you've got in your contract. The building surveyor will do it for you as well, but you should do it yourself just to make sure. It's very rare that goes wrong, but it's worth checking.
I think noting on that, just for our listeners too, what you're referring to from a deposit point of view there is the preliminary works, or that sort of initial deposit that people pay is all they've got to pay until they've signed their contract. And then once the insurance is issued, the 5% or balance of 5% deposits required at that point.
That's right. Absolutely, Darren. That's a very fundamental point to understand, which is that there's different types of contracts you can have with a builder. The one which really matters, and the one which is the HIA contract, is the contract to do the actual building work. There are sometimes other arrangements in place which are legitimate and very good for consumers, where they can secure a price, secure a plan, and pay a small deposit. And it's usually, we're talking about maybe a couple of $1,000 or even less sometimes. And they are not building contracts as such. They're not building contracts where you need to have the insurance. They are commercial arrangements to set you up towards the building contract.
Right. If we talk about the contracts themselves, Keith, could you maybe outline some of the more common errors, that occur in those contracts, and I guess for both buyers and builders, and how can they best prevent them? Maybe highlight a couple of those would be terrific.
Yeah, look, I think probably the first point I'll make is that a lot of errors with contracts in the broad sense are actually with the plans and specs. And that's not me having a go at architects or designers or builders. It's just pointing out that a lot of the detail done by builders for each individual job is in that area. And that's where you're most likely to have the odd little mistake. So it's always important to make sure that they're checked off. And that's one reason why builders do that. Other key errors we see, and one is special conditions. Now, special conditions are something that they can be used, but they don't need to be overused. What we find is that sometimes you'll get builders who'll put in excessive special conditions because they're just trying to deal with every single contingency. Now, a lot of the time they don't do any harm. They're not really intended to do anything unfair to the consumer. They're just trying to provide more certainty. But because our contracts have been so tried and tested, what you'll usually find is that our contracts generally cover most scenarios. It may not be obvious at first reading, but it's there. And so you don't necessarily need to overburden your contracts with special conditions. That said, because our building legislation is so old for regulating contracts, there are some gaps, and some of the laws are out of date. And so it's not unreasonable for builders to put in special conditions to cover some of those situations. And so that's totally fine as well. One thing I also would find, though, is that with contracts, consumers also just need to think through a couple of key things. One is, and this is amazing how often this has happened, we get consumers arguing about who should actually be signing the contract. Now, the law is relatively simple. If your name's on the title, or is going to be on the title, you're the person who signs the building contract. Not your parents, not your husband or wife. It's got to be the person who is actually going to be the owner of the land. And we do get cases where we get husband and wife as a common scenario, or partners, and they'll have one person owns the land, but they both want to sign the contract. And that just doesn't work. It can be done, but it's not really appropriate. If someone wants to be financially involved, they can guarantee the contract. Another key problem we see, and this is a bit more embarrassing for me as an ex-lawyer, is that we sometimes get clients who get lawyers going through their contract without really understanding how the domestic building system works. And I've even had cases where we get builders calling us up at the HIA and saying, "Oh, I've got a client who's got a lawyer. The lawyer's saying we've got to take out this clause which says this contract price is subject to change because of these clauses. Do we have to do it?" And I and my colleagues have to say, "Well, actually, you can't. That's part of the contract which the government has says must be in the contract. You can't cut it out." But you get lawyers saying, "Oh, no, you've got to take it out." And that comes down to probably a pretty important point, which is that for many builders, contracts are fixed price. And by fixed price, what they mean is the price all going well and nothing changing is going to be this. However, even the most locked in price could change a bit. It could be something as simple as there's some delay damages towards the end of the contract. And that can go either way. It could reduce the price paid by the consumer, or it could slightly increase it if they've caused delays to the builder. There's also potentially extra payments for late payments or progress payments. That changes the contract price, albeit usually very small, slightly. You also have variations, and they can happen. And of course, that can change the price. So it is important that, yes, it is a fixed price contract, but it's up to you whether it stays that way as a consumer as well as to the builder.
Yeah, we've highlighted when it comes to getting finance as well in previous episodes a number of times, people dealing with a broker who doesn't know construction, and that pretty much 9 times out of 10, if not more than that, falls on its face because they don't understand construction. And
yes,
with our jobs quite regularly too, they're sent off to a solicitor to review the HIA contract, and they come back with pages and pages of this must be removed and this, and we just answer NO.
yes,
we can't touch that contract, people, sorry. And whoever you're paying all this money to review it, it's quite frustrating because clients have faith in them, and we're telling them it's an industry contract. The builder didn't make this contract. The special conditions they popped in, they chose the method. That's it. Like you can't just take that out.
Indeed. And look, you're absolutely right, Colin. And I think it's important to also keep in mind that, and this is probably an observation for most areas of law, quite frankly, normally you're best off going and talking to a lawyer who actually has experience in that particular area, because they don't just have better understanding and immediate access to knowing what the exact legal obligations are, but they also understand the environment in which those contracts are being made and used, and they can understand whether or not something is actually okay or not. If you go and see your, dare I say, uncle, I forget your uncle you keep on referring to, but you have an uncle who happens to be a solicitor, Uncle Gary, who does wills down the street. And that's not trying to disparage lawyers who do wills. That's an important thing. But if they don't do much else, they may not necessarily have the experience and understanding of the industry to actually help you with that. So if Uncle Gary's telling you that, look, no, you need to rip all this stuff out of the contract to protect yourself, with all due respect to Uncle Gary, he's probably got the wrong end of it. And so you do need to make sure you find the right lawyer. The Law Institute of Victoria, which is the professional body for lawyers in Victoria, does have on their website a very good referral service, which you can use to find a lawyer if you don't have one who's already got that experience. And I would suggest that if you're a buyer looking for some help, not only with the contract itself, but with anything else later on, you go to that service to get some help to find the right sort of lawyer to help you.
Yeah, that's great. Darren, some good proof in the pudding there that Keith's been listening to the podcast, talking about Uncle Gary, and we might have introduced another one last week, the Barbecue Bandits.
The Barbecue Bandits. I have listened to that podcast. I must have missed that bit. I must have been too busy driving. Sorry.
It's just released, that one, the Barbecue Bandits, but it is something that we like to talk about a fair bit. But let's get back on track. I have a habit of taking it off track, but I'll put it back on. What advice would you give to home buyers when they are reviewing the contract, in addition to the sort of resources you just said, getting legal advice the right way? Is there anything else, I guess, that you would cover for someone listening right now who's not quite sure where to go, what to do? And I ask that because a lot of people think that if they go to Uncle Gary, that will help, or if they go to whatever solicitor that is. But for people who don't have the money to do that, and they've been given a HIA contract,
yes,
how would they give them a little tip or something in terms of you'd help them with. Yeah.
Look, there's probably a few tips I can give. The first one is, which is probably reasonably rare, but it has happened, so I'll mention it, is that our contracts come in two main forms. One is a printed version, which is a nice glossy cover, and it's a booklet. And the other version is an online version, which is printed off with often logos from the builder on the front, but it's a printout. If you're given a photocopy of the printed version, I'll be very careful. That means the builder's chosen to not keep on paying for proper fresh contracts for their consumers. And what we have noticed is that whilst contract laws don't change frequently, they have over time changed. And we have had cases where a builder's thought, okay, I bought a contract 3 years ago. Okay, I'll just keep on photocopying it and keep on using it. And then in the meantime, the laws changed quite a bit and there's some new requirements. That contract's out of date and actually may not protect the consumer or the builder properly. So photocopies are a real no-no. I would strongly urge you not to sign a photocopy. And yes, I have to appreciate we sell them, so I know that there's also an interest for us in that. With the printed versions, we have at times had reports about the contracts looking a bit weird. We've even had consumers come into our office and say, I don't like your contract. It's a printout. And I look at it and go, it's actually not entirely our contract. Someone's put stuff in there. So if the contract looks a bit shoddy in its print quality, or it looks like it's not formatted correctly, or things don't seem to match up, maybe be a little bit careful. Particularly if you're dealing with some smaller builders who, and I don't want to say this is common, but we are unfortunately at the moment in a scenario where we do have some builders who are not entirely legit, and regrettably some are going through a court process at the moment. And so you do just need to be a little bit careful. If something doesn't quite look right, don't be shy about getting help. And quite frankly, if a consumer feels that they've got a dodgy contract of ours, I'm more than happy for them to contact us and say, is this really one of your contracts? Now, we'll be happy to step up and say, yes, it's our contract, or no, it's not. So please don't be shy about that. Otherwise, look, the key points for a person who doesn't want to go and see a lawyer or can't afford that sort of expense and wants to avoid Uncle Gary is take the time to check particularly the schedules of the contract. That's where the real detail is. The terms and conditions of the contract are pretty routine. They're locked in, they've been used for a long time, and they don't change. Check that and check those schedules. Make sure that the description of the work, the plans and specs being referred to are correct. Make sure you understand the progress payments. Are you using the standard government-imposed method from the 1980s, or are you using a more modern progress payment schedule? Method 2 in our contracts, Method B in the MBA. Make sure you understand what's there. Make sure you look at whether there's any exclusions. There's a schedule in our contract, Schedule 5, I think it is, which will list anything that's not being done by the builder. Make sure you look at the front bit where there's the reference to the connection costs. I think you might have spoken about that recently as well. They are, unfortunately, due to government activity, particularly in the space of gas connection, changing quite a bit. And so I would strongly recommend you look at that and understand that they are good estimates, but they can be a little bit subject to change. But make sure you do look at those. And I think fundamentally, if you're not sure about anything in the contract or it doesn't quite look right, go and talk to the builder. As I said before, the builder is happy to talk through with a potential client or upcoming client and make sure that they are comfortable with what they're signing up. And if you're not sure, you're better off asking at the start than waiting and finding out later that your assumption was wrong or you should have asked the question. So don't be shy about taking that time. It's all part of that advice I gave before, which you don't want to rush signing a home building contract. You could be signing a contract for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $1 million. It doesn't matter. Either way, it's a huge contract. And so you should take the time.
I think also, Keith, a lot of builders will share a copy of their generic contract that they're going to, that you're going to sign prior to. So you can always request that up front so that you get a chance to review that before you get to the point of getting plans and pricing and all the rest of it put through that contract. So at least you understand what you're up for, and that buys you that time to really absorb it, understand, ask those questions, and I'd suggest most builders would be more than happy to do that for their customer. So
Yes.
Always be asking those sort of questions. And I think the other one would be really check your plans and your costings to make sure that those things you're expecting are actually
Mm.
shown, and obviously, am I right in saying that the written overrules the plan? So if it's written in the contract and says you're going to get, just as a simple example, a dishwasher, but your plans don't actually show a picture of a dishwasher, the written overrules says you're getting a dishwasher. Is that fair to say?
Look, yeah, it's a pretty bit of a complicated area, but the basic rule is that the plans are the specifications take priority over the plans, and the terms of the contract take priority over both of those. Now, usually the HIA contract, won't really have much reference to what's actually being built, other than a description of what documents are being included.
Yep.
So normally any discrepancy will be in the specification or the plans. And so it is important to take the time to go through those things. And we have had cases where we know consumers have had something which is very important to them, and they haven't bothered to check that it's actually been carried through. Sometimes errors can happen. A lot of home building contract work is very routine. It's very much follow a set process. And so it can be at times that things get missed. And so it is important for consumers, if something's really important to you, if you need an extra wide garage, to quote one infamous case, don't be shy about just making sure and checking. It might not be missed, but it might be, and just make sure. And that's part of that. Take the time, but you should look at the plans and specs. They can be quite large documents, but once again, you'll find that there's parts of those documents which are more variable, more specific to your job. And what you should do is, if you've got a document which is a set of plans or is a set of specifications, you'll normally see it as a section which is very much focused on your particular job. And if you need to focus your attention, focus on that stuff. That's where you'll find what's most important to you.
Yep, absolutely. Great advice. Can you shed some light on some of the recent or upcoming changes, in building codes and regulations that obviously will impact builders and buyers, together, and what, people should be prepared for?
That's right. Look, there's certainly going to be sometime this year some reasonably dramatic changes starting to the way that we regulate the home building industry in Victoria. The big change, which is probably most likely to happen soon, is the introduction of a new regulator, which will hopefully help to resolve some of that issue I talked about before with the cracks between the two regulators. So we're going to have the Victorian Building Authority replaced by a new Building and Plumbing Commission, and it will have additional powers with respect to resolving disputes between consumers about contracts as well as the building code stuff. And so hopefully that will help to clarify some of that. We're also expecting to see the domestic building insurance system changed. And now that change may not be as dramatic as perhaps the government's making it out to be, but it will be a change where if a builder is failing to comply with orders to fix defective work, including after they've handed over a house, the insurance can be called upon, domestic building insurance can be called upon to compensate the owner. At the moment, if you're a client who has a builder who is not doing what they should have done, they're not honouring their agreements, or you've sued them and you've got a judgment against them, for example, you still can't claim the insurance until that builder either dies, disappears, or becomes insolvent.
Yep.
And practically, that can be extremely painful. Insolvency is not a quick process in many cases. And so there's plenty of stories where consumers have got a builder who's clearly stopped operating, but they can't use their insurance because the builder's still technically solvent. They haven't been liquidated.
Yeah.
So this change will hopefully deal with those more extreme cases, and they are a relatively small number, but that change to the insurance should hopefully help that and give consumers a bit more certainty that if they've got a job with domestic building insurance and things do go badly wrong, the system's there to protect them. So hopefully that will help for those thankfully rare scenarios. I guess the other key change will be that the regulator will also have a power to go to homes that have been finished and occupancy permits have been issued and go back to the builder who built it and say, you've stuffed this up. You haven't built this according to the code, for example, fix it or else. And if they don't fix it, they could potentially lose their builder's license or the insurance could be invoked. So that will once again deal with those more extreme cases where if the builder has really stuffed it up, then there's a power for the government to step in and help resolve it. The other key thing will be, though, consumers need to be realistic. You're not going to get the new regulator coming to your house to say issue an order to a builder to fix the paintwork, which isn't to your exacting standards, but is actually quite adequate, or minor defects. The government's not going to be able to have people come to every person's home and say, builder, go and fix this gutter, which you failed to install properly, or more likely, fix the gutter because the client forgot to clear it out every year or so, and it's now started to leak. Well, no, that's not what the system's for. It's to deal with those terrible cases where a minority, and it's very much a minority of builders, have done defective work, shocking work, and left consumers in a terrible situation. These powers are expected to deal with that. And hopefully that will give everyone more confidence and also, quite frankly, discourage people who want to behave that way from being in our industry.
Last year we kicked off mid-2024 nearly the National Construction Code 22, so we say NCC 22 changes. What's to be expected in the upcoming, or just in the future, is some further regulation changes around that construction code?
Yes, there is sometime soon, and we haven't got complete details yet, going to be a ministerial council. So that's a group of building ministers around the country getting together to decide whether they'll approve what's called NCC 2025. Now, that document doesn't do too much to detached homes. It does makes a few changes, including particularly some of the requirements about eaves and so on. And so it's not a minor thing, but it's nowhere near as big as NCC 2022, which ironically only really became effective in Victoria in 2024. So I think if I can give consumers one bit of advice about NCC 2025, don't expect it to necessarily be something that has any effect in 2025. Ideally, if HIA gets its way, it will take time. Now, we don't oppose changes to improve the quality of building work or to improve energy efficiency, but we also know that it takes time for changes to be adopted, both by builders, but also by suppliers and manufacturers. And they also come at a cost to consumers who are looking for homes. And so our case has always been that, yes, you do need to gradually reform and improve building laws, and there are ways you can improve it, but you certainly don't want to be imposing massive changes like they did with NCC 22 that had to eventually break up, and expect consumers to have to bear a massive increase in costs. And we're talking 10, 20, 30 or more $1,000s.
Yeah.
And then you've got also the problems that you've got to wait for certain suppliers to be up to speed, and they generally do a good job, but it takes time still. And so this is all something that frustrates people getting their home built. And what's probably worse is that often the NCC changes now are relatively incremental. They're not making massive changes, which will be a huge benefit. They are improving things gradually, usually. So it's not as if you need to somehow magically force it through very quickly. And so ideally, we'll see these changes flow through. Now, when they do come through, as we experienced back in April this year, there often will be a bit of a rush to get homes signed up to be built to ensure you don't have to pay the extra costs. I don't think you'll see that so much with NCC 2025 because the changes aren't so dramatic, but there is a meaningful impact. So you may find that at a certain point in time, you'll hear from builders that, look, if you want to get a slightly lower price or a bit more certainty about what you're getting built, you might want to sign up sooner rather than later. That's not the builder trying to use a hard sell tactic. That's the builder giving you some practical guidance that there are some meaningful changes coming, and it does have an impact on your hip pocket. And so that is a genuine bit of advice they're giving you to try and help you. It's not a salesman tactic.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. It was a difficult transition across to do that. The NCC 22 stuff, and just the internal cost for a builder to update masters and all that sort of stuff is far beyond what a home buyer would even not bother, but would actually truly understand.
Indeed.
So definitely yeah, it definitely had an impact in a time where everyone was just trying to scrape together some jobs and get some margin in the first place.
Exactly.
It wasn't great timing, but I guess, yeah, it's also like, well, if we don't do it now, when do we do it? And it always gets pushed back. And releasing 24 for a 22 code was,
Yes.
proof in that pudding. So anyway, just to wrap this up then, Keith, let's talk about the future of housing in Victoria. You just choose what you want to cover, but let's talk about things potentially: population growth, sustainability, affordability, skilled labour, innovation, anything like that. How does it look moving
Absolutely.
forward?
Look, well, first of all, we probably need to keep in mind that particularly Melbourne, is a big city. It's growing quickly. It's going to be, if it's not already, the biggest city in Australia. And I know there's a lot of debate about whether that's a good thing or not, and I understand that. But it's what's happening. And it's because Australia as a whole, and Melbourne in particular, is a very attractive place to live. Now, if you go I've travelled a fair bit around the world, and realistically, we get it. We get it pretty good in Australia. We have a very good lifestyle. We've got a lot of things that people to be very envious about and really want to have for themselves. So it's not surprising our population continues to grow. So there's going to be, for home building, a fair bit of confidence that there will be work coming. What we're experiencing at the moment is a bit of a debate about what those homes should look like and where they should be. And there's a really interesting discussion I have to regularly have with the government about whether they favour detached homes, greenfield homes, or whether they favour infill apartments. And we're talking about everything from small townhouse developments through to high-rise apartment blocks. And that's a mix. And the problem that I often find is that there tends to be a view that, well, infill is much better than greenfield, so therefore you've got to have everything favouring infill. But there's one problem with that, and it's the consumer, the buyer. What do they want? What do they want to have? And once again, this is an example of governments in particular, but also other stakeholders, having this view that they know what's best for people. Now, quite frankly, I believe most people are quite capable of making rational decisions about what sort of home they want, where they want to live, what sort of trade-offs they're prepared to make in return for having that thing that they want. And I do feel at times that there's a real paternalistic approach taken by government. And I think it's really important that that point continues to be stressed, because, yes, there are costs with having the city expand, and there is some trouble with that. But there's also costs and problems with having cities become much more dense, and that can also be a problem. And fundamentally, people will choose where they want to live. So at the moment, there's a government policy that 70% of new homes should be infill, 30% greenfield. We're nowhere near that. It's not even 50-50, quite frankly, at times. Yes, there will probably be more apartments being built. People will make those decisions that they want that sort of living, and that's great. And we'll see that continue. But we also will continue to see a lot of people wanting to live in cities, in the outer suburbs, or in regional cities. And they also need to have support to get their homes built. And I think that's an important thing. Another key point to stress will be, there's a big debate about modular housing. Commonwealth Bank yesterday made a big announcement about providing support for those businesses, and that's great. And modular prefabrication has been gradually happening. And Colin and Darren, you're probably better placed than me to talk about how it's gradually started to become part of the industry in many ways, but it hasn't taken it over entirely. It will continue to be an important part of the housing mix and may become even more important, but it's important to stress that more traditional, more standard home building methods are going to be around for a long time. And so sometimes you'll get a lot of publicity about, oh, this is the new technology, this is the new stuff we're doing. And there can be a bit of forgetting about, well, the routine, the standard, tried and tested, which meets the needs of people, still continues as well. And so that's another key point. Skilled labour is obviously a massive problem. We have two major challenges. One is sheer numbers. It's difficult to get people to work in the trades. And that's really sad, because it's actually, for many people, a great career. And I talk to a lot of my members who have started off as apprentices and are now running their own businesses. And some of them are very, very bigger businesses. And it's really an amazing opportunity. And I know I went to university and I've done a ridiculous amount of degrees, but that's what suits my skill set. But for a lot of people, being outdoors, being out and about, moving around, talking to people regularly, doing things with their hands, that's actually what they're better at. That's what they like doing. And that's a great career. And you can really have great success there. And so getting more people involved in trades is going to be a critical challenge. Yes, it's true that maybe prefabrication and modular housing will to some extent mitigate some of that, but we're still going to have to get a lot more people working in industry. And if there's parents listening to this podcast, particularly of teenagers, I'd say to them, don't be too quick to assume that going off to university and getting a degree is the best way forward. Quite frankly, when I was at law school 30 years ago now, there was a joke about arts degrees, which was that the first thing you often say at your job as an arts degree graduate is, would you like fries of that? Now, it's not necessarily the golden future, a degree.
Yeah.
What is actually going to be better for you, and where are the options? And it may also be that AI does also eventually start to lead to a reduced need for white collar jobs. And so if you're thinking, we'll go off to university and do a white collar job in the future, that's possibly a less attractive option as time progresses. So it's something that I think parents should think about, because usually it's parents we hear from our members who are discouraging people from becoming apprentices. And I think you just need to be a bit more open-minded.
I think I saw it was was there an incentive for apprentices announced?
Yes, there's been a government announcement by the Commonwealth Government about, and this obviously will be pending the election and what happens there. It may also end up being matched by a different government if that's what happens. But yes, $10,000 paid over time as you progress through your apprenticeship.
Yeah.
And that's a good idea, and it helps to encourage people to stay. We do get a bit of a dropout rate. Now, that's partly natural. People try something and decide it's not for them. Okay, that can happen. But also it can just be that particularly when you've got tough times, as we've had more recently, the lack of work can start to make it seem less attractive. And I can't avoid making this point, which is that you also have sugar hit jobs being available in government infrastructure projects where, dare I say, EBAs and other arrangements have led to people getting short-term massive payments for their work, but then potentially after another year or two finding, the sugar hit stopped. Where do I find work? So we also find that we have apprentices who are going off to do those short sugar hits, but then I suspect in a year or two they're going to start thinking, oh, well, what's next?
Yeah.
And the blunt reality is that for any career, and particularly a building trade, you've got to put the hard work in, get the experience, build up to start to really become a long-term success. You just don't get it overnight, because a couple of people have gone to the Fair Work Commission and signed a bit of paper for a few years. It doesn't by itself do anything. So it's really important that if you're going to be working in the building industry, you have that long-term view and understanding that you can't necessarily get everything overnight. You can't have a Ford Raptor during your first week as an apprentice. You have to take your time.
Yeah.
You can a couple of years after you've finished your apprentice, let me tell you.
Yes, that's true. Yes, absolutely.
There's plenty of them getting around.
There is.
That's
Excellent.
great advice.
Well, any final thoughts there, Keith, to finish up?
No, look, I think what I would just like to really finally sum up is that, look, first of all, I really do enjoy your podcast. And I think it's important that buyers get the message that builders want their clients to be happy. Most builders rely on referrals, good experiences. It might be that you only had one home built for you during your life, but you're probably going to be going to a lot of barbecues. Avoid those bandits, but you might be going to a lot of barbecues and talking to your friends about the way your home was built. And so for a builder, that can very quickly become, well, if you've done a bad job, there can be quite a few barbecues taking place, a lot of people going to those barbecues. So it is important for builders that they keep their clients happy, they look after them. And in fact, when I first joined HIA, the first week I was answering the phone with queries from members, I had a builder call up saying, oh, I've got a client, the gutters are starting to rust, and I want to know whether I'm obliged to go back and fix it. And I said, okay, well, when did you build the house? Oh, 16 years ago. I said, okay, well, no, you don't technically. There's a 10-year requirement if you've done bad work, but you don't have to go back. And he said, "Oh, but it's a client. I built for her 16 years ago, and she's a nice lady, and I want to help her." And he probably went off and did fix the guttering for her anyway. And so that's the sort of mentality that a lot of builders have. And even the bigger building companies, you'll find that culture that they started off with doesn't disappear. It's still there. But making sure that you've got ongoing clients. And I went to a function recently where a very well-known builder told a story, and you've probably heard this story, but he drove past a house he had built 20 years ago and went in to make sure it was still okay. And that's not uncommon. And I think buyers need to understand that, yes, you get these horror stories in the media about dodgy builders who have done terrible work. But like anything in the media, it's usually, medias don't sell newspapers or don't get clicks nowadays by having stories about good things. All the good stories, all those thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of homes being built in Victoria, happily occupied, happily being used, that's a good news story. And if you're a buyer, particularly if you're reasonable at the start and make sure you do the work at the start, you're going to be one of them in the future, happily living in your house.
Yes,
that's
fantastic. Great. Good wrap up. Daz, anything else?
No, mate, really thrilled. I think there's so much great content today, Keith, you've shared with our listeners. And obviously we're really keen to get this episode out and live as soon as possible because I think they're going to take so much away from that. So we really appreciate your time. I know I've harassed you a little bit to get you on, but we've got you here now. So
no, there's no harassment, Darren. I've been really happy to come on and join you. It's just been, it's a busy life, but it's been great. I really appreciate you inviting me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
There you have it, folks. A very, very extensive episode. And thank you again, Keith. We do appreciate you taking the time and just an opportunity to give insights to people in the industry, the builders and people who work for them, but also the home buyers as well. So for all you who've listened to the podcast, please, if you like it, jump on and give us a 5-star review on the platform you're on. If you've got some topic ideas, any questions you want to send us, please do that. Just jump on the website. There's a contact us button, or you can send us an email, which is brand new, Darren, by the way, hello@homebuildinghub.com.au. And other than that, we thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you and preparing you another topic on the next one. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the podcast, guys. And just our disclaimer, whilst we're all about providing value to you, this podcast should not be considered as legal or financial advice. It contains general information only, and you should seek out independent professional advice on your personal situation before making any legal or financial decisions.
1